My fiancée whispered. Relax, my dad's judge friend will protect us. I smiled and said, good thing evidence doesn't care. Delivered security footage to the court clerk, canceled the wedding, and watched her powerful family lose every argument. Relax, Celeste whispered, her lips barely moving, one hand resting on my forearm like she was calming a nervous child. My dad's friend is a sitting judge. He owes our family more than you can imagine. Whatever you think you have, it won't matter. I looked at her, not with panic, not with the trembling disbelief she was clearly expecting. I looked at her the way you look at someone who just played their final card face up on the table before realizing you were holding the whole deck. I smiled, a small one, the kind that comes from somewhere quiet and certain inside you. Good thing evidence doesn't care who you know, I said. She blinked. Her father, Douglas, was standing 6 feet away in that polished marble hallway outside the mediator's office, and even he caught the shift in my expression. He didn't like it. I could tell because his jaw tightened and he looked away first. That was the moment I knew. Everything I had spent the last 4 months carefully, silently, methodically building, it was already sitting in the right hands. The court clerk had stamped it 48 hours ago. The wedding was 11 days away, and I was already gone. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Let me back up, because this story makes a lot more sense when you understand what I walked into and what I chose to walk out of. I was 31. Celeste was 29. We had been engaged for 14 months, together for 3 years before that. Her family had money, not generational old money quiet, but the loud, name-dropping, we know everybody kind of money. Her father Douglas was a corporate attorney with a regional firm that handled property and development contracts throughout the state. He liked being the most important person in any room he entered. He had the particular habit of wealthy men who had never truly been refused. He listened to you just long enough to identify how you were useful. Her mother, Vivian, collected charity board positions the way other people collected stamps, not out of passion, but because it kept her name in the right publications. She was not unkind. She was performing kindness, which is a different thing and takes more energy than people realize. Her older brother Conrad had a vague title at his father's firm, Senior Acquisitions Consultant, which as far as I could tell meant he attended lunches and signed off on things other people understood. Conrad was the kind of man who peaked at 22 because his surname opened every door before he arrived, and he had spent the decades since assuming that would continue indefinitely. They were not bad people in the cartoonish villain sense. They were the kind of people who genuinely believed that the rules were written for everyone else. That belief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it wears a very good suit and pours you an expensive drink and calls it a courtesy. And Celeste was the product of all of that. Charming, intelligent, breathtakingly beautiful, and so fluent in the language of access and influence that she didn't even notice when she was using it. I noticed. But back then, I told myself it was just the environment she grew up in. I told myself people are more than their families. I was right about that in theory. I was wrong about Celeste specifically. I ran a small commercial property management company that my father had started 22 years before I took it over. Nothing glamorous. We managed leases for mid-sized commercial tenants, restaurants, small retailers, medical offices, across about 40 properties in the metro area. We weren't Douglas-level wealthy, but we were stable, debt-free, and had a reputation for being honest brokers in a business where that's rarer than people admit. My father had built that reputation slowly, carefully, over 2 decades. I had spent 5 years maintaining it before he retired. It mattered to me in a way that was hard to explain to people who didn't understand what it meant to inherit something your father bled for. That context matters, because what happened next was never really about the wedding. It was about that. The first thing I noticed was the Alderman Square deal. 8 months before the wedding, Douglas approached me about a joint venture. His firm represented a development group that wanted to acquire a mixed-use property we managed in a transitional neighborhood that was quietly becoming valuable. The deal was reasonable on its surface. They would acquire the property, we would retain management contracts for 3 years post-sale, and our tenants would receive lease protections during the transition. I was cautious, but not opposed. I brought in my attorney, a careful and methodical man named Trevor, who I had worked with for years. Trevor reviewed the initial terms and flagged a clause buried on page 41 of the purchase agreement, a clause that allowed the development group to reclassify the property category within 90 days of closing, which would have voided every single tenant protection we had negotiated. Every restaurant owner, every small business who had trusted us to protect their leases would have been exposed to termination notices within a quarter. I asked Trevor if this was an oversight. He said it was not. The clause was too specific, too deliberately worded to be accidental. I went back to Douglas with a simple request: remove the clause, and we proceed. Douglas smiled that smooth attorney smile and said the clause was standard language and that I was overthinking the risk profile. I told him I wanted it removed. He said he'd look into it. He never removed it. And that's when I started paying attention. The second thing I noticed was the timeline. Specifically, I noticed that the first conversation Douglas had with me about the Alderman Square deal happened 9 days after Celeste had spent an evening in my home office reviewing what she called our financials to help prepare for the wedding budget. I had left her alone in there for about an hour while I took a call. I thought nothing of it at the time. She was going to be my wife. But when I thought back on it, the timing, the specificity of Douglas's initial offer, the way he had structured the terms to mirror exactly what I would consider borderline acceptable, I realized something uncomfortable. He had known our margins before he walked into that meeting. He had known which number would keep me at the table long enough to get me to sign. And the only person who had access to those numbers, who had been alone in that office, who had any reason to pass them along, was Celeste. I didn't confront her. Not then. I'm not impulsive by nature. My father used to say that the man who reacts first usually loses last, and I've found that to be true more times than I can count. Instead, I started watching. I upgraded the security cameras in my office. Quietly. The building already had a system, but I added 2 additional interior units, one facing the desk, one covering the filing area, and linked them to a cloud server that was not connected to the office network Celeste used when she visited. I used a vendor I had never worked with before. I paid in full upfront. I kept the invoice in a folder at my home, not at the office. I told no one. Not Trevor. Not my friend Derek, who knew more about my life than almost anyone. Not my father, who I would have normally called on a thing like this. No one. Because the value of what I was doing depended entirely on no one knowing it was being done. The moment a single person in my circle knew about the cameras, there was a non-zero chance that information traveled, not through malice, but through conversation, the way information always travels. I had already learned, at some expense, what it cost to let information travel in the wrong direction. I just watched. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening when I was supposed to be at a site inspection in the Eastern District, Celeste let herself into my office with her key. The site inspection had been rescheduled. I had not told her. I watched her on my phone, live feed, from a parking garage 2 miles away. She sat at the desk. She opened the 3rd drawer on the right, which she had no reason to open because it contained nothing personal, only property files. She photographed 12 pages. Then she left. I sat in that parking garage for 20 minutes before I drove home. I was not angry. I was something colder than angry. I was resolved. Trevor got a call from me the next morning before 8. I told him I needed to understand what had just occurred legally, precisely, and completely, and that I needed him to treat this as the most sensitive matter he had ever handled for me. Trevor is not the kind of man who dramatizes. He listened. He asked 3 clarifying questions. Then he said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." So I did. I told him about the Alderman Square deal. I told him about the clause on page 41. I told him about the timing of Douglas's initial approach and Celeste's evening in my office. I told him what I had seen on the security feed. Trevor was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, "This is not a relationship problem. This is a potential corporate espionage situation with a real evidentiary trail, and you need to treat it exactly that way. You cannot tip her off. You cannot confront anyone. You need to let me work." I told him I understood. I told him I had already decided not to confront anyone. I told him I just needed to know the full picture before I made any decisions. He said, "Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I came home to Celeste every evening. I sat across from her at dinner. I watched her laugh at something on her phone and show it to me, and I laughed too. I listened to her talk about wedding details, the exact shade of ivory on the table linens, the specific arrangement of the centerpieces, whether the ceremony program should be folded or flat. I gave opinions. I said, "Folded looks more intentional," and she agreed and wrote something in her notebook, and I watched her write it. I lay next to her at night and thought about the 3 years before this, the first trip we took together, The morning she called me from a parking lot crying because her college roommate had been diagnosed with something serious. The afternoon she helped me pack up my father's office when he retired, and how gently she handled every photograph. I thought about the version of her that existed in those memories. And I understood, lying there in the dark, that those memories were real. She had genuinely cried in that parking lot. She had genuinely been careful with my father's photographs. Real moments don't stop being real just because the larger story turns out differently than you believed. That was the complicated part. The grief wasn't about fiction. It was about something real that had coexisted all this time with something I hadn't seen. I let myself grieve it quietly while she slept. Because I already knew. You don't document 12 pages of commercial property files by accident. You don't know which drawer to open by accident. You don't do it once. Trevor came back to me in 10 days, not 2 weeks, because what he found was more structured than either of us had expected. He had pulled every public filing connected to Douglas's development clients over the prior 18 months. He had cross-referenced them against the properties in our portfolio. He found a pattern. 3 separate deals in which properties we managed had been acquired by development groups represented by Douglas's firm, all at valuations that were, in Trevor's words, suspiciously precise relative to non-public margin data. Not just Alderman Square. 3 deals. In 2 of those deals, we had sold without fully understanding we were being lowballed based on internal numbers that should have been confidential. My father's company, the company he spent 22 years building, had been quietly, systematically undercut using information that had been fed to the opposing counsel by someone inside my home. Trevor set a folder on the table between us. He said, "What I cannot prove yet is the direct chain, specifically who passed the documents to whom and when. What I can prove is the pattern of precision across 3 transactions that is statistically implausible without inside information." "But," he said, "you mentioned security footage." I told him I had more than mentioned it. I told him I had 4 weeks of cloud archive footage showing a specific instance of document access. I told him I had the original files she photographed, time-stamped, and logged. Trevor looked at me over his glasses. "Then we have a chain," he said. We spent the next 6 weeks building it properly. Quietly, methodically. Trevor brought in a forensic document specialist to analyze the property files and cross-reference the photographic evidence from the security footage. We obtained time-stamped records from the cloud server. We pulled communication logs that were discoverable through legitimate channels. We did not cut corners. We did not rush. We were not trying to win a fight. We were building something that would stand on its own in front of people who had never met us and had no reason to believe anything we said unless the paper said it first. Trevor's standard for everything was, would this hold without us in the room? If the answer was anything less than yes, it went back for more work. Some nights, he called me at 10 or 11 to walk through a single document, to verify a date, to confirm a chain of custody detail. There was a week where we went back and forth on the authentication of one specific file because there was a 17-minute window in the cloud timestamp that could theoretically be questioned. We resolved it with a secondary log from the building's network provider. 17 minutes. We spent 2 days on 17 minutes. That's what it looks like to build something that doesn't fall apart. During all of this, the wedding planning continued. Celeste's mother Vivian had booked a venue that seated 320 people. There were florists and caterers and a photographer who had been flown in from another city. There was a rehearsal dinner reservation at a restaurant that had a 3-month waiting list. There were save the dates that had already gone out. I attended every planning meeting. I made decisions about centerpieces. I agreed to the 4-piece string quartet for the ceremony. I smiled in every photograph Vivian took of us during the venue walkthrough. I did not feel good about any of it. But I also understood that the moment I showed my hand, the evidence I had would become contested, the people involved would begin managing the narrative, and the window Trevor and I had to place everything properly would close. So I smiled at the venue walkthrough. And I kept working. The conversation that changed the pace of everything happened on a Sunday afternoon at Douglas's house. It was a family dinner, the kind Celeste's family did about once a month, where Conrad would hold court about deals he barely understood, and Vivian would steer every topic back to the wedding, and Douglas would sit at the head of the table performing benevolent patriarch. After dinner, Douglas asked me to walk with him to his study. I knew this moment was coming eventually. He poured 2 glasses of something old, inexpensive, and gestured at the chair across from his desk. He said, "I've been hearing that your attorney has been pulling public filings, specifically filings connected to my clients." I kept my expression neutral. I said, Trevor does thorough due diligence. It's why I keep him." Douglas smiled. It was the smile of a man who has never lost. He said, "I've known you for 4 years. You're smart, and I respect that. But there are rooms in this city that you have not been in, and there are relationships that were built long before you arrived. I want you to understand something, not as a threat, but as a courtesy. My firm has worked with the same judicial community in this district for over 15 years. That's not a boast. That's a reality. So whatever review your man Trevor is conducting, it might be worth asking yourself if the result you're hoping for is actually reachable." I looked at him. I said, "I appreciate the courtesy." He nodded like that was the end of it. It wasn't. I called Trevor from my car before I reached the end of Douglas's street. I told him what Douglas had just said, word for word. Trevor was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Accelerate. I want everything filed and documented through the court clerk's office within 72 hours. Not to a private attorney's desk. Not in a drawer. Stamped. Entered. On the public record. Once it's there, no one, not a judge, not a favor, not a 15-year relationship, can touch it without that being its own additional problem." I said, "Do it." The 72 hours that followed were a controlled sprint. Trevor worked through the night on the first night. The forensic specialist submitted his final authentication report. I drove personally to Trevor's office at 7 in the morning on the second day and signed every document that required my signature. I reviewed the full evidentiary packet. It was thorough. Timestamped security footage showing Celeste accessing and photographing internal property files on a specific date and time. The original files she photographed, preserved with a verified chain of custody. The forensic analyst report connecting those files to the specific confidential margin data referenced in the Alderman Square acquisition proposal, the proposal that arrived 9 days later. The pattern analysis across 3 transactions, prepared by a commercial property valuation expert Trevor had retained. Communication records obtained through legitimate discovery channels showing correspondence between Douglas's firm and the acquisition groups during the same windows. It was not a theory. It was a constructed, authenticated record. Trevor hand-delivered the full packet to the court clerk's office at 2:17 p.m. on the second day. Stamped. Entered. On the record. I was in the waiting area of that office when it happened. I watched the clerk stamp the first page, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt like I could breathe. I called off the wedding that evening. Not in a dramatic scene. Not in a confrontation I had been scripting in my head. I called Celeste and asked her to meet me at a coffee place near my apartment. Neutral, public, quiet. She came in smiling, probably assuming I wanted to talk about something logistical, the seating chart, the hotel room block, the rehearsal dinner. She sat down across from me. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was not the evidence. It was a letter, 1 page, for paragraphs, written by me without Trevor's input, because some things should be in your own words. It said that I had discovered what had happened. It said that I understood what had been given to whom and when and why. It said that I was not angry in the way people expect from a moment like this, but that I was finished, completely, permanently, without negotiation or reunion, finished. It said that the appropriate legal process had already begun through proper channels, and that any attempt to interfere with that process, intimidate witnesses, or contact me through intermediaries would be documented and treated as additional evidence of intent. It said I wished her no harm. It said I was done. Celeste read it. She read it twice. She looked up at me and her face had gone through 3 different expressions by the time her eyes met mine. Shock first, then something calculating, then a kind of controlled composure that told me everything I needed to know about how she had been taught to handle exposure. She said, "You don't understand what you're starting." I said, "I'm not starting anything. I'm finishing it." She said, "My father will." I said, "Your father was told, in his own study, that I was paying attention. He chose to take that as a warning rather than an answer. That was his decision." She stared at me. Then she said, quietly, almost to herself, "You already filed it." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. I stood up, picked up my jacket, and left her sitting there with the letter. The next 48 hours were exactly what I expected. Douglas called twice. I did not answer. Conrad called once, which I found almost comedic, because Conrad had never called me about anything more substantive than which golf course we were using for the bachelor party. Vivian sent a text that said, "I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding, and I would very much like to speak with you before things go further." I forwarded it to Trevor. On the morning of the third day, Douglas had his attorney, a different one, not from his own firm, reach out to Trevor directly. They requested a meeting. Trevor agreed to a meeting. He called me afterward and said, they want to discuss a private resolution. They're using the word mutual a great deal. They want the filing withdrawn. I said, what did you tell them? Trevor said, I told them that the filing is public record and cannot be withdrawn unilaterally, and that my client has no interest in a private resolution. I also told them that any further contact attempting to influence the process would be logged and potentially relevant to the question of consciousness of guilt. They didn't love that answer. I said, good. The mediation session was Douglas's idea. His new attorney suggested it as a good faith gesture to explore whether this matter could be resolved without further escalation. Trevor told me I didn't have to go. I told Trevor I wanted to go, not because I expected to resolve anything, but because I had sat across from Douglas at his dinner table for 4 years, and I had watched him perform authority and certainty and ownership of rooms, and I wanted to sit across from him in a room where none of that mattered. Just once. I wanted to see what that looked like on his face. The mediation session was held in a neutral office building downtown. Douglas arrived with his attorney and Conrad, who sat in the corner looking like he genuinely didn't understand why he was there. Celeste was not present. Her absence told me something. It told me Douglas had assessed the situation and decided Celeste's presence was more liability than asset in a room where documents were going to be discussed. It told me he was smarter than I had given him credit for in some ways. And it told me he had already internally accepted that she was exposed. The mediation opened with Douglas's attorney delivering a very smooth, very calibrated speech about the complexity of overlapping professional and personal relationships and the value of preserving what had been built across multiple meaningful connections. I sat and listened. Trevor sat beside me and said nothing. When Douglas's attorney finished, Trevor placed a copy of the filed evidentiary packet on the table. He said, this is the public record as filed. My client would like to direct your attention to items 7 through 14, which include the authenticated security footage, the chain of custody documentation, the forensic analysis report, and the transaction pattern analysis conducted by a certified commercial property valuation expert. My client is not here to negotiate the existence of these items. They exist. They are stamped. They are on the record. If you'd like to discuss a path forward that accounts for these realities, we're prepared to listen. Douglas's attorney started to speak about context and intent and the relationship between what documents show and what they mean. I let him talk, and then I watched Douglas's jaw tighten because Trevor had put the actual evidence on the table, and it was real, and it was specific, and it had dates and times and authentication marks, and there was nothing performative about it. It was just true. And truth, in my experience, has a particular quality in a room full of people who have spent their careers managing the distance between what happened and what can be proven. When truth is specific, time-stamped, and authenticated, it gets very quiet. The room got very quiet. It was during a break in that session that Celeste appeared. I don't know who called her, or if she had been nearby the whole time, but she walked into the hallway where I had stepped out for water, and she fell in beside me like she had been rehearsing the approach. She looked composed, polished, the way she always was when she was managing a situation rather than experiencing it. She said, I know you're angry. I said, I'm not actually. She said, you have every right to be. I said, Celeste, I'm not here because I'm angry. I'm here because 4 years ago your father was given confidential information that belonged to my family's business. And that information was used across 3 separate transactions to reduce our negotiating position and transfer value we had earned to parties your father represented. I'm here because the person who provided that information was you. And I'm here because the documentation of all of it is already in a place where your father's relationships don't reach. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, close, her voice dropping the way it used to when she was telling me something she didn't want anyone else to hear, relax. My dad's friend is a sitting judge. He owes our family more than you can imagine. Whatever you think you have, it won't matter. And I smiled. That small, certain smile. And I said, good thing evidence doesn't care who you know. She stared at me. I could see her recalibrating. I could see the moment when the composure developed a hairline crack. She said, you already filed it. Same words as before. Same tone. Like she was confirming something she had been hoping wasn't true. I said, 48 hours ago. Stamped. Entered. Public record. Your father's judge friend would need a very specific and very public reason to touch it now. And I suspect he doesn't want that kind of attention. She didn't say anything else. She walked back into the conference room. I finished my water and followed. The mediation ended without resolution, which Trevor had told me was the most likely outcome. Douglas's attorney said they needed time to review the materials more thoroughly. Trevor said we would be available for further discussion through proper channels. We left. In the elevator, Trevor said, "That was as clean as it gets." I said, "What happens next?" He said, "Realistically, they have 3 options. 1, they engage with the legal process formally and hope the evidence is insufficient to meet the evidentiary standard, which it is not. 2, they make a settlement approach that involves genuine accountability, which their ego will resist for longer than is strategically wise. 3, they do nothing and wait, which is what most powerful people do when they're used to problems going away on their own. The problem," he said, "is that this one isn't going away." He was right. I want to pause here because I know what people are going to think about this part of the story. They're going to think I was cold, that I executed this with a kind of clinical detachment that isn't normal for someone whose engagement just ended. And there is truth in that. But what I want to say, and I want to say it carefully, because it's the only thing in this story that feels genuinely complicated, is that the coldness came after. The grief came first. In those 2 weeks of watching Celeste over dinner and sleeping next to her and attending florist meetings like nothing had shifted, I was not numb. I was heartbroken in a very quiet and private way that I did not let myself perform, because performing it would have cost me everything I was trying to protect. I thought about the version of her I had believed in. I thought about the version of us I had wanted. I thought about my father, who built something honest and was quietly taken advantage of because I had let someone into my home and trusted her with things that weren't only mine to share. That was the grief. The part people don't see. The 3 in the morning part, alone, in a dark room, understanding that something you loved was never quite what you believed it was. And then you put that down. You get up. You protect what your father built. You make sure the record is accurate. You let the rest be what it's going to be. The fallout came in stages. First came the social pressure. Mutual friends began calling, cautiously at first, then more directly, suggesting that both sides should find a way to communicate and that these things can be resolved. I was kind with each of them. I thanked them for reaching out. I told them I wished everyone well and that I was not interested in discussion. Most of them stopped calling after 2 or 3 attempts. There was one who surprised me, a man named Victor, who had been closer to my side of the friendship circle than Celeste's. He called and said, "I don't know what happened, and I'm not asking. But whatever it is, it's clearly real, and you clearly made a decision, and I respect that. I'm not going to be in the middle. I just wanted you to know I'm not going anywhere." I told him that meant something. It did. One of them, a woman named Gretchen who had been closer to Celeste's friend group than mine, told me flatly that I was ruining a good family's reputation over a business disagreement. I told her I respected her perspective. I did not call her back. Second came the legal maneuvering. Douglas retained a second attorney, a more aggressive one, who began sending letters questioning the chain of custody of the security footage, the methodology of the forensic analysis, and the independence of the property valuation expert. Trevor responded to each letter with the relevant documentation. The chain of custody was airtight. The forensic analyst had 40 years of court-accepted work. The valuation expert had testified in over 230 cases. Each letter that arrived challenging something was answered with specific, source documentation that left no room. After the 6th letter, the challenges stopped. Third came the approach through Vivian. About 3 weeks after the mediation, Vivian sent me a handwritten note, actual pen and paper, probably because she had been advised not to put anything in email. It said she was a mother who was watching her family suffer. It said she knew I was a man of character, and that a man of character should consider the people on the periphery of a situation who had not chosen it. It said she hoped I would consider what grace looked like in a moment like this. I read the note twice. I thought about it. And then I thought about the 40-year-old businesses whose lease protections had been quietly stripped in transactions that were structured using information stolen from my office. I thought about those business owners, people who trusted my family's name, who had been exposed to risk they didn't know about because someone I loved had photographed files they had no right to photograph. I sent Vivian a brief, respectful reply. It said, "I understand a mother's position in this. I also understand that accountability and grace are not opposites. The process that is underway is not about punishment. It is about the record being accurate. I hope your family finds its way through it with honesty." I did not hear from her again. The outcome, when it finally came, was not explosive. Powerful people rarely go down in explosions. They go down in careful, quiet, procedural steps that take longer than anyone expects and look almost anticlimactic when they finally arrive. Douglas's firm was subject to a formal ethics review by the State Bar Association, not because I filed a complaint directly, but because the documented pattern of transactions, once entered into the public record, triggered a review by a third party who had been watching that segment of the market for reasons entirely unrelated to me. The review took 4 months. I was not called to testify. I was not required to appear. The record appeared for me. Every timestamp, every authenticated document, every page of the forensic analysis, it all spoke in a room I was not in. I found that satisfying in a way I had not expected. During those 4 months, 2 of the development groups Douglas's firm represented settled quietly on terms that were more favorable to the sellers, including a partial recapture that flowed back to our portfolio in the form of a structured adjustment that Trevor negotiated without fanfare. It was not the full value of what had been quietly taken. Trevor was honest with me about that. He said, litigation could recover more. But litigation is expensive, it is slow, and the outcome is never guaranteed. What we have now is real, it is clean, and it is done. I told him to finalize the settlement. We finalized it. Douglas was not disbarred. I want to be clear about that, because people will want the more dramatic ending. He received a formal censure, which, in the legal community, is the equivalent of a permanent mark on your record that follows every introduction, every client pitch, every courtroom appearance for the rest of your career. His firm lost 2 significant development clients in the 6 months following the censure, not because of any legal requirement, but because in a business built on trust and discretion, a public censure changes the calculation for people who have other options. Conrad left the firm quietly about 2 months after the review concluded. He took a position with a development group in another state. I did not have feelings about Conrad one way or another. He was a man who had always been a footnote. The judge, the one Celeste had mentioned in that hallway, the favor-owing friend her father had dangled like a shield, was never involved, because the evidence never gave him the chance to be. That was the whole point. My friend Derek, who had watched pieces of this from the outside without knowing the full picture, asked me about 6 months after the wedding didn't happen, "Do you regret how you handled it?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I regret that it happened. I don't regret how I handled it." He said, "Do you miss her?" I said, "I miss who I thought she was. I miss who I was when I believed that version of her. But you can't go back to believing something that isn't true. And you can't mourn a real person by attaching that mourning to a version of them that only existed in your own interpretation." Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a very practiced answer." I laughed. I said, "I've had 6 months." He laughed too, and it was genuine. The first time laughing at something connected to all of it felt genuinely light. My father found out eventually, not from me first, which is one of my few regrets from the entire situation. He heard it third hand, from someone connected to the commercial property community, and he called me on a Tuesday morning and said, "I'm hearing things." I drove to his house that afternoon. I sat at the same kitchen table I had grown up eating breakfast at, and I told him everything. He listened the way he always listened, completely still, no interruptions, his hands flat on the table. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You protected it." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry this happened." He said, "You protected it." And then he put one hand on top of mine on the table, and that was the whole conversation. I understood what he meant. I understood that the company was not just money to him. It was proof that you could spend your whole life doing things the right way and come out the other side with something real. It was proof he could pass down, and I had kept it intact. That mattered to him in a way that went beyond the financial. And sitting there at that table, it mattered to me in the same way. The wedding venue sent a formal invoice for the cancellation. It was substantial. Vivian contested my right to cancel unilaterally, arguing that the deposits had been made jointly. Trevor wrote a brief letter. The venue refunded my portion within 10 business days. The florist kept their deposit, which was fair. The photographer was gracious and returned everything, which I thought was unexpectedly decent. The caterer sent a handwritten note wishing me well, which I kept. The string quartet was apparently rebooked for another event the same weekend. I found a small and perhaps inappropriate satisfaction in imagining that. Celeste reached out once, about 4 months after that coffee shop meeting. Not a call, a single email. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It said, "I want you to know that I am aware of what I did and what it cost. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I know." I read it 3 times. I thought about responding for about 2 days. Then I decided that some statements don't require a response. That sometimes the most accurate reply is silence. Not out of cruelty, not out of ongoing punishment, but because some chapters are complete. And adding more words to a complete chapter doesn't honor it. It just muddies the ending. I let it sit in my inbox for another week. Then I archived it. And I moved on. There are things I would do differently. I would have secured my office earlier in the relationship. Not because I was suspicious, but because I learned that protecting information that belongs to other people is its own kind of obligation, separate from trust. I would have asked Trevor to review the Alderman Square clause before I attended that first meeting, rather than after. I would have paid more attention to the early moments when Douglas steered every conversation toward what I owned, what our margins looked like, what properties we were considering next. I noticed those moments and filed them under, "He's a curious man who likes information." I should have filed them differently. I would have told my father sooner. Those are the things I would change. The rest of it, the patience, the documentation, the decision to let the process do what processes exist to do, I would not change any of that. Because there is a version of this story where I confront Celeste the night I see her on the security feed, where I walk in the door and put it on the table and let the whole thing explode in one emotional, uncontrolled moment. And in that version, the conversation becomes about feelings, about history, about whether I'm overreacting, about the relationship and what it meant, and all of that emotion becomes the story, and the actual documented record of what happened gets buried under the weight of a fight that neither side can win cleanly. The evidence doesn't care about that fight. The evidence doesn't care who cries, or who yells, or who has the most persuasive argument in a room, or whose father knows which judge. The evidence just sits there, stamped, entered, on the public record, patient, waiting for the right moment. And when the right moment comes, it speaks in a voice that no amount of connection or leverage or carefully cultivated 15-year relationship can interrupt. That's the thing about evidence. It doesn't need you to believe it. It doesn't need the room to be sympathetic. It doesn't need anyone's permission. It just needs to be accurate. And this was. People sometimes ask me, mostly people who know pieces of the story, not all of it, if I was ever scared. If there was a moment when Douglas's implied threat, that warning in his study with the expensive pour and the smooth smile, made me consider backing down. I tell them the truth. I tell them, yes, for about 4 minutes in a parking garage 2 miles from my office on a Thursday evening, watching a live security feed on my phone. For minutes of something that felt like vertigo. For minutes of understanding that the path I was already on, the one I hadn't consciously chosen yet, but was clearly heading toward, was going to cost something. The relationship, obviously. The wedding, obviously. The future we had sketched out. The house we had talked about. The life we had half seriously planned, obviously. But also something harder to name. The particular hope that comes from deciding you have found your person. The settling that happens in your chest when you believe the searching is over. That specific kind of peace. All of that. Gone in 4 minutes. And then the 4 minutes ended. And I put the car in drive. Because the other option, pretending I hadn't seen what I had seen, letting it continue, building a marriage on a foundation that I had watched her actively compromise, was not survivable either. It would just take longer to show. And I had watched enough things take longer to show. I drove home. I made dinner. I smiled at the right moments. And I built the record. The one thing I never said to anyone, not even Trevor, not even Derek, not even sitting at my father's kitchen table, is that there was a moment during all of it where I almost told Celeste, not to warn her, not to give her a head start, but because I had loved her, because somewhere in the gap between who she was and who I had believed she was, there was a real person that I had real feelings for, and there was a small, irrational, very human part of me that wanted to give that person the chance to choose differently, to tell the truth before the evidence told it, to own what had happened and put it on the table and let us both deal with it as adults. That part of me lasted about a week. And then I watched her pick out napkin colors for the reception with Vivian over video call, laughing about ivory versus cream, and I understood that the person I wanted to give that chance to did not exist. The person who existed had weighed her options and chosen the napkin colors. And that was the end of that particular almost. I did not narrate this story for anyone's entertainment. I narrated it because it happened. Because it happened in a way that was precise and documented and methodical. And because every time someone tells this kind of story, the version they tell is the emotional one. The confrontation, the crying, the dramatic moment in the hallway. And I wanted to tell the other version. The one where the most powerful moment is not a confrontation. It's a court clerk stamping a document. It's a piece of paper sitting in a system that does not care what your last name is or who owes your father a favor. It's a security timestamp on footage from a camera that was never announced. It's 41 pages of authenticated evidence that speaks more clearly, more permanently, and more effectively than anything I could have ever said in a room. Power is loud. I understand that. Douglas was loud in his polished, smooth attorney, expensive poor kind of way. Conrad was loud in the way of men who have never been told no. Celeste's whisper in that hallway was the quietest version of loud I have ever encountered. But evidence is not loud. Evidence is patient. Evidence doesn't need an audience. Evidence doesn't care if the room is sympathetic or hostile or indifferent. Evidence does not get tired. Evidence does not second-guess itself at 3 in the morning. Evidence does not wonder if it was harsh or unfair or too extreme. Evidence simply is. And patience, properly built and properly placed, is the only thing that power has ever truly been unable to negotiate with. They lost every argument because none of their arguments were addressed to the right audience. They argued to me. They argued to the idea of me, that I could be warned or managed or calmed or convinced to accept the private resolution that kept everyone's names out of it and let the whole thing dissolve into a business disagreement that nobody ever mentioned again. What they never fully accepted, until it was too late, was that I had already removed myself from the argument entirely. I had handed the argument to the evidence. And the evidence had already won. The clerk had stamped it. The record was entered. And no favor, no relationship, no 15-year understanding between a powerful attorney and a sitting judge. None of it could reach into that filing and pull a timestamp back. You can negotiate with people. You cannot negotiate with the record. That's the last thing I'll say. Not because there isn't more. Not because the story doesn't have corners I haven't shown. But because the part that changed me, the part that I think is worth passing along to anyone who has ever sat across from someone powerful and felt the ground shift, is that you can negotiate with people. You cannot negotiate with the record. Build the record. Be accurate. Be patient. Let it speak.